Hello, this is Dr. Branch. I'm going to talk to you today about modes of moral reasoning and what about ethical conflicts. What do we do when norms come into conflict? You should think carefully about this. Perhaps you've wondered about the hypothetical scenario of the proverbial Nazi at the door. You're a farmer in France during World War II. You're hiding Jews underneath the farmhouse in a basement in a root cellar or something, and the Nazi Gestapo comes looking for Jews, and they knock on your door and say, "Are there any Jews in your home?" And the question is, do you tell the truth and then they find the Jews and kill them, or do you lie and hopefully they won't find the Jews? The issue is lying always wrong if you have the proverbial Nazi at the door? This is a question that gets asked in ethics classes. Now, I want to go ahead and tell you as we go into this. In Geisler's book, he says this: there are only 6 ethical systems. Do you see this word systems here? That's important. Each designated by its answer to the question, are there any objective ethical laws? Actually, I disagree with Geisler's statement here. The ethical systems are what we talked about in the previous lecture: teleology, deontology, and virtue ethics. What he calls ethical systems in his book, is really 6 different ways of resolving conflicts between 2 competing moral absolutes. That's what he's trying to say. So I disagree with Geisler's terminology, and what he outlines are 6 ways of resolving moral conflicts. But once that correction is made, the 6 chapters he gives are actually a good description of these 6 ways of resolving moral conflicts, or as I like to call them, modes of moral reasoning. The first one is antinomianism. This view rejects any moral absolutes. The word antinomian literally means against law. It is the exclusion of all ethical norms. There are no absolutes. Some advocates you see here. First of all, Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher, he said, "No man steps into the same river twice, for fresh waters are ever upon him." That's sort of a way of saying there's nothing permanent but change. Perhaps the most well-known antinomian was Friedrich Nietzsche, and he said God is dead and we have killed him. And Nietzsche said lots of bizarre things, but most of them revolved around his own egocentric view of life. And for Nietzsche, there was no moral absolutes, and that led to a very low view of women and a very low view of Jewish people in his own world. Jean-Paul Sartre said this: "You are your life and nothing else." The French existentialist philosopher, that's from his book No Exit. And so there are no moral absolutes. So the way that this view resolves moral absolutes, if you have the Nazi at the door, well, you just do whatever is most pragmatic for you at that time, because there are no moral absolutes. Now, there's several critiques one can make about the antinomian position, but I want to point this one out. It's self-refuting. The person who says there are no moral absolutes has just stated a moral absolute. It's the either or. It's the law of non-contradiction, that an entity can't be both A and non-A at the same time in the same relationship. This either or just presents itself in life, and so they've at least got one absolute, and that is there are no absolutes. So it's a self-refuting position. It's individualistic. Geisler says this: not only is an antinomian ethic like a ball game without rules, it is also like a game without umpires. Everyone is really their own umpire, since there are no objective moral laws that bind anyone. When he gave this illustration, I thought back to an event when I was in 9th or 10th grade in high school. And we were a bunch of country boys at a rural high school, and we got to school early. We would shoot basketball for a good 20 or 25, 30 minutes before school started. And there was this one guy named Bryant Burdett, and he fouled mercilessly. My goodness, he was just a hacker. And he had almost gotten a fight one day, and he started screaming at me, "We don't have any umpires here. We don't have any referees here. There are rules." And then we entered into this philosophical debate between 2 rednecks whether or not there actually are rules, even with no umpire present. Well, my friend was advocating an antinomian view. He wasn't my friend, but he was a jerk. But he was advocating an antinomian view, and I was advocating a deontological view. There are always rules. Anyway, it's individualistic. Here's modern antinomianism from the group 3-6 Mafia in their song "It's Hard Out Here for a Pimp." It's expletive, deletive up where I live. They're from Memphis. but that's just how it is. It might be new to you, but it's been like this for years. It's blood, sweat, and tears when it come down to this, expletive deleted. I'm trying to get rich before I leave up out of this, expletive deleted. I'm trying to have things, but it's hard for a pimp, but I'm praying and I'm hoping to God I don't slip. Yeah. Okay. Well, he's praying to God that he will be a successful pimp. And in fact, when they won the Academy Award for the Best Soundtrack Song, Juicy J, the man singing this song from 3 6 Mafia, thanked Jesus in his acceptance speech. Okay, not only is this man confused, but that's antinomianism. Now, generalism, I won't say a lot about this. This view says there are many ethical norms, but none are specific in nature. So if you're dealing with the moral conflict, you just kind of come up with some general ethical norms, and you would say, well, I don't have any real moral absolutes in conflict here as the Nazi is knocking on my door. Really, the general rule is I should take care of innocent people, so I'm going to do whatever lets me take care of that. So this generalism lends to utilitarianism. And so the problems with it, there are no universal norms. Moral absolutes disappear. Situationalism, 40 or 50 years ago in a Southern Baptist seminary, I fear that you would have been taught situation ethics. Situation ethics is most often associated with Joseph Fletcher, a liberal Anglican, Episcopalian. He was from the States, Anglicans from England, Episcopalian. He says this: there's only one universal norm: do the loving thing. Well, what the loving thing is changes from situation to situation. I want to caution you, be alert. This is not a Christian way of viewing things. When he says do the loving thing, and he uses the term agape, he redefines it in a non-biblical, non-Christian way. I've had some students in the past that say, oh, this looks like a good idea, just always do the loving thing. Well, you have to understand, for him there are no moral absolutes, and the loving thing changes from situation to situation. He uses an example in his book about a group of settlers on a wagon train headed out west. They're ambushed by Indians. They're hiding in the woods hoping that the Native Americans don't kill them in this ambush. And there's a child there, and the child starts crying. So what are you going to do? If you stop the child from crying by covering its mouth, the child will die. But if you don't cover its mouth and the child cries out loud, you're going to be massacred by the Indians. Well, the problem with this view and the example that Fletcher gives that I just described to you, he tells you what your options are. He limits your options. And what I've just given you is a false dichotomy. There's always a third option, that is return fire. Dr. Branch considers himself a heavily armed dove in this respect, but I guess my point is that they're limiting your options, and I cannot stress the degree to which situation ethics is not a view that a conservative Christian should hold. There you see some advocates. And I've already said this. This view misunderstands agape, and in fact it fails to clarify what agape actually does require of moral agents. In the Bible, agape is defined by the cross of Jesus Christ. For Joseph Fletcher, this guy right there, agape is just a warm, fuzzy, emotional feeling. I suppose you're supposed to wait for the rainbows and the unicorns to come out, and then you know you're doing the agape thing. Also, I'd point out to you, Uzzah thought he was doing the right thing. Do you remember this story from 2 Samuel? They're taking the ark back from the place where it had been located. They're taking it up to Jerusalem, and they put it on a cart. They're supposed to be carrying the ark. Well, the oxen stumble, the ark starts to fall off the cart, and Uzzah reaches up to grab it, and God strikes him dead. Why? Because you're not supposed to touch the ark. Here's a takeaway from this story. Listen very carefully. Was taking the ark to Jerusalem a good thing? Absolutely. It should be done. But the good goal, getting the ark to Jerusalem, didn't mean they could do it any way they wanted to. God had given specific rules. They're not supposed to put the ark on a cart. They're supposed to carry it with those poles through the hoops on the side of the ark. So they're doing it the wrong way. Here's the point out of this. God is concerned about both the means and the goals. So this is a critique of situationalism. And it also has a defective view of human nature. Humans are sinful, and we tend to do what prospers or is the best thing for us usually. And so it boils down to ethics versus schmethics. Ethics is a narrow door, and schmethics is a broad door called situational ethics. I think it's a schmethics. If you want to know another good term for situationalism, you've got it right there. Ethics, schmethics. Now, the last three are actually ways that can be used by a conservative evangelical Christian. The first is what's called non-conflicting absolutism or unqualified absolutism. This view says there are many moral absolutes governing life, and these never come into conflict. All moral conflicts are apparent, they are not real. Advocates of this view base their position strongly on the doctrine of providence, and if you're going to choose a doctrine on which to base your ethics, God's providence is a good one. And so, if you've ever heard Charles Stanley say that you should trust God and leave all the consequences to Him, that's actually a statement of non-conflicting absolutism. Now, here's what I would say. John Murray, by the way, is a Presbyterian guy. He was a strong advocate of this. He died a few years back. Well, here's what I would say. Most of us live our lives as non-conflicting absolutism. I would say that for 99.9% of life, this is how life is lived. And Dr. Stanley is exactly right. You trust God, do what He says, and leave all the consequences to Him. I believe that's right. Here's some weaknesses, of the view. It does ignore it ignores the reality of moral conflicts that do occur. Now, I suggest to you that most of us will live our entire life and never be faced with a moral conflict, something like the Nazis knocking at the door. But those conflicts do occur from time to time in life. And so I would just say that a weakness of this position is it seems to just excuse away those conflicts. Another view is called conflicting absolutism or ideal absolutism. By the way, this view, non-conflicting absolutism, they would say that you come up with creative ways to deal with the Nazis. So if the Nazis are at the door and you're hiding the Jews in a trap door under your table with maybe a rug over the trap door, and they knock at your door, they say, "Do you have Jews in the home?" You say, "Well, sure I do. I got Jews right under the table. Just go ahead and look. They're right under the table." Well, by being sort of smart alecky, you're technically telling the truth, but your tone is misleading, and so you found a creative way to work out of the dilemma. But I would suggest that your creative way has been basically an attempt to lie without telling a lie. Anyway, conflicting absolutism says this: when norms do conflict, moral absolutes conflict, it's wrong to disobey every one of them. You do the least amount of evil possible, then when you pray, you confess the sin to God. So this view would say the Nazis are at the door, and they ask, "Do you have any Jews in your house?" You lie. You use any type of subterfuge to throw the Nazis off the scent of the Jews. You don't want them to find these innocent people. And then when the Nazis leave, you get on your knees and confess to God that you have sinned. That's basically what this view says. There are some advocates of this. Helmut Thielicke, a German theologian. Richard Land, a former president of the ERLC, and a guy that I really like, is an advocate of this view. Here's some critiques of it. It seems to be saying we have a moral duty to sin, and this seems absurd to some people. This is a hypothetical one. I want to stress Jesus never sinned. He was tempted in all ways just as we were, yet without sin. So this is just a hypothetical, and certainly Dr. Land and Helmut Thielicke, neither one of them are suggesting that Jesus sinned. But it's just a hypothetical that Jesus lived in the same fallen world in which we currently live, so he could have been faced with a moral dilemma. This view could hypothetically result in a sinful Jesus. But I want to stress that Dr. Land doesn't believe in that Jesus sinned. He certainly believes that Jesus was sinless. So this is more of a hypothetical objection. I would say this, that I believe this view grants too much authority to evil people. I have questions about whether or not an evil Nazi intent on murdering innocent Jewish people has the right to demand truth. Suddenly, the Nazi who is murdering people is morally indignant because I've lied. The last view is called graded absolutism or hierarchicalism. And this view says this: there are many ethical norms that sometimes these do come into conflict. One is morally right to break a lower norm in order to keep a higher norm. When one does so, one has not sinned and has no need to confess sin. So for this view, if the Nazis are at your door, they're banging on the door, "Do you have any Jews?" You use any type of subterfuge at your disposal to throw the Nazis off the trail of the Jews they're trying to find. And when they leave, you thank God for having the courage to do that, but you don't confess it as sin. So this is basically how view 5 and view 6 differ. Under view 5, which is conflicting absolutism, after you lied to the Nazis, you confess it as sin. Under view 6, which is graded hierarchicalism, you lie to the Nazis, but when they leave, you haven't sinned and you don't confess it as sin. There's some advocates of this view. Dr. Patterson at Southwestern Seminary, W.D. Ross was a secular person. John and Paul Feinberg, Geisler advocates this view. So I would say we are dealing with rare instances when these things that, when these moral absolutes conflict. I just want to remind you, most of us will never have a Nazi pounding at the door looking for Jewish people. It does happen sometimes in life. I'm going to skip past some of this. Here's what I want to point out to you, that the Sanhedrin told Paul and Peter not to preach in Jesus' name, but they said, you choose whether it's right or wrong. We have to obey God rather than man. So they seem to be saying we have a higher demand here, and God institutes government. We know that elsewhere from the Scripture. So they're saying we have a higher moral duty to obey God than obey you. I would point out to you, Rahab is praised for hiding the spies. Some of you may be writing a paper on that for this class. Here are some critiques of graded absolutism, graded hierarchicalism. Some call hierarchicalism a veneer of situational ethics. And you know what? There's some legitimacy to that. I have seen students over the years take graded hierarchicalism and use it as a moral excuse to be a coward, really. And so I've seen it turned into situational ethics. There can be a prostitution of method that it simply becomes an excuse for subjective judgment. This is how I feel at this moment about what I'm going to do. For those who do not accept the Bible as authoritative, there's no objective standard. And I'm going to skip past this about are all sins the same. Basically, Geisler argues that they're not, and I think he's right. Well, how do we reconcile the hypothetical Nazi at the door? What do we do? Well, here's my conclusion. First of all, practically, non-conflicting absolutism is the rule. There is a cost for doing the right thing, and I'm afraid sometimes as Christians, what we call a moral conflict is really, it's not really a conflict between right and wrong. We know what the right thing to do is. We just don't want to pay the price for doing the right thing. I give an example in my notes, and you can read it. And imagine this. Imagine a Christian businessman, born-again guy, goes to a good Baptist church, and he's a sales leader in his company, a large corporation, and some people from another client come in from out of town, and this is an account the company really wants to get. And the boss comes into the Christian businessman and says, "Hey, look, we have these clients from out of town, and tonight they want to go out on the town. I need you to take them out, and they want to go to a strip club." So the guy comes to his pastor and says, the Christian businessman says, "What am I going to do? I have a moral dilemma. I don't know what to do. If I don't take these men to the strip club, I'll lose my job, and we'll lose the account, and I won't be able to provide for my family. But if I do take them to the strip club, I'll be doing something I know God says is wrong, but I have a moral dilemma. I don't know what to do." Actually, this is not a dilemma. The right thing to do is to look your boss straight in the face and say, "I'm not taking anyone to a strip club, and I'm embarrassed that you asked." That's the right answer. Now, someone might say, "Well, if I do that, I might lose my job." Yeah, you might. There's a cost for doing the right thing. And in fact, you might lose your job, but you've still done the right thing. And at this point, I'm borrowing from Dr. Stanley. He's absolutely right. We walk by faith, we do what God says, and we leave the consequences to God. So I want to be very clear. What a lot of people are calling moral conflicts aren't moral conflicts. It's just a conflict of courage. And I pray that if I'm ever in such a situation, I'll have the courage to do the right thing. There is a human tendency to overstate moral dilemmas. That echoes some of the things that I've said earlier. Do not baptize every temptation as a matter of moral conflict when the issue may simply be choosing between obedience as opposed to disobedience. Now, I will end by saying this. In the rare instances when you have a conflict such as the Nazi at the door, and it's a real moral conflict, I suspect some form of hierarchicalism might be the right answer. But I want to restate that I have some concerns about the way hierarchicalism has been abused. In the past, in my ministry as a professor, I was adamantly for graded hierarchicalism. But as the years have gone by, I've moved away from it somewhat over the years. So I still believe it may be the right way to resolve moral conflicts. But if it is the right way, it's the right way in very rare instances. And I've just seen too many students who claim to want to be Baptist preachers abuse graded hierarchicalism, and I don't want you to do that. Well, I hope this has given you some food for thought as we think about the ways to resolve moral conflicts.